If you haven't read this fascinating article by Bruce Lesnick titled Good News, Bad News for Addressing Climate Change, there's a link to it on our Facebook page, but that's okay because we're going to go through it for the first half an hour of the program. But first, Scott sent me this article. I read it. I was like, oh my goodness, this is so cool. And at the bottom of the article, there's actually a contact for Bruce. You can email him. And I sent him an email. I said, Bruce, I just read your article. It's very fascinating. Would you ever want to come on the show and talk to us for a couple of minutes? And Bruce, within an hour of me emailing him, had called me back, and we did a quick interview there on the spot. I recorded this less than a couple of hours ago, right before we came on the air. And this is a privilege for me to share with you. Here is our interview from just a couple of hours ago with the author of this article, Bruce Lesnick, Good News, Bad News for Addressing Climate Change. Here we go. An honor and a privilege to have on the line with us Bruce Lesnick. He's a longtime political activist who lives and writes just north of me in Washington State. He blogs. You can find his work at opensalon.com. And Bruce, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Bruce, this is the first time I've ever read any of your work, and I was blown away by how articulate and brilliant your article, which if folks haven't read it, by the way, I found it at commondreams.org, but again, you can find it at opensalon.com. It's titled Good News, Bad News for Addressing Climate Change, and it is definitely my number one most recommended thing you should read today. Bruce, can you tell me, just a little bit about yourself and share with our listeners who might not have ever read your work before? Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then tell us, of course, what is the good news and the bad news for addressing climate change?
Right. Well, as for myself, I've been active in politics and radical politics since I was in high school, beginning with protesting the war in Vietnam and U.S. involvement and support for South Africa and many labor struggles and other things continuing up until today. The good news, bad news for climate change, as I see it, the bad news is that in order to address this problem, which a higher and higher percentage of scientists agree is a difficult problem that we're facing, or a real problem that we're facing, in order to really address it, requires addressing the underlying economic system that's dominant in the U.S. and the world today, which I submit is holding us back, is standing in the way of actually achieving a real solution. The reason for that is because our economic system, which is known as capitalism, rewards all of the wrong behaviors. It's profitable to pollute. It's profitable to spew out greenhouse gases. It's also profitable to have endless war and other forms of exploitation. And that kind of reward system is incompatible with solving these problems that we need to address.
Absolutely. I think we talk about on our show on Filter Free Radio all the time of how important a real radical revolution of values is for all of us to undergo right now, that we so desperately need to grasp the idea that people are more important than profits. And like you're saying, is I guess is what I'm trying to gather from you, Bruce. Am I right? And you're saying that that's kind of an important first step?
Yes, I think very much so.
Right. And so can you talk a little bit about how the capitalism really is part of the problem? Can you dive into that a little bit?
Well, sure. First of all, what is capitalism? It's private ownership or private profit of the main industries, banks, resources, and so on a large scale. Running those things for private profit contradicts at almost every turn what is needed for the public good. There's a definite disconnect there. There's other things that define how capitalism works that also sort of run afoul of human needs in many cases. If you ask what is profit and where does it come from, the simplest answer is that it unpaid labor that's produced by millions and millions of us that we have no say over in terms of where it goes, how it's collected, what it's spent on. That kind of system is undemocratic economically and politically, and it results in a system where today we really have something much more akin to $1, one vote than one person, one vote.
Right.
And of course, when all those dollars are collected in very few hands, it explains a lot about how policy is made today.
Absolutely. Follow the money. That's another great first step, right? And I love you write in your article about Noam Chomsky, who is one of the fantastic authors that I'm beginning to read a lot more of and familiarize myself with and learn from and grow with. Can you talk about how it seems like, and I'm being facetious here, of course, but it seems like there really is no alternative out there to capitalism, at least from what I can see. And how come, why is that, Bruce, in your opinion?
That's an excellent question. It's a complicated question. It's not something that can be answered in a short soundbite. The short answer is that our own government and others who are considered like-minded allies, Britain, France, Germany, Canada, have done everything they could to make sure there was no other positive example in the world. Anytime there's a revolution or a fight for national independence where there's the threat or possibility of people taking control of their own lives, moving things in a different, more democratic, more economically democratic direction, it has been brutally assaulted and crushed by our own government with our own tax dollars. And that's the main reason that you don't see another positive example in the world today. There are no perfect examples, but there are some things that one can look at in history as real positive elements. And I think many people should pay a little bit more attention to Cuba as an example of a place where, far from perfect, there's much positive to learn about what has happened there since the revolution there in 1959. And if nothing else, be able to explore the question, why does the United States have diplomatic relations with Russia today, the Soviet Union formerly, China, Vietnam, and no formal diplomatic relations with Cuba? What is it about Cuba that we're supposed to shun it even more than every other country? So again, there's things one could critique, but it's a wonderful example of people rejecting the imperialist, profit-driven motive and for running a country and the economy, and striking out in a different direction. And that's something that just gives fit to the business community here in the U.S.
Absolutely. If folks are just joining us, we're speaking with Bruce Lesnick. He's a longtime political activist, writes, and you can find his work at opensalon.com. And one of the things that I often get feedback from my friends and people I have conversations with just day to day is so often it's, oh, you're full of nothing but bad news, and it all seems so despairing. And I always try to maintain the optimism. Of course, despair is not an option. One of my favorite quotes of Noam Chomsky is, to paraphrase, given the two choices we have, one is to do nothing and ensure the worst is going to happen, or two, to try to fight back. There's real no choice. You found the good news, Bruce Lesnick, and can you tell us really what, and I love this, this is so, for me, inspiring and motivating and encouraging, being a 25-year-old, soon to be 26 in 2014, moving forward. This is so motivating. Bruce, can you share the good news with us?
Sure. Well, some of the good news, as I see it, is that the same obstacles to really addressing climate change happen to be the same impediments, the same roadblocks to solving some other problems that we've been unable to deal with for generations. Problems like endless war, massive unemployment, exploitation, racism. These kinds of problems, it turns out, there's also great profit to be made in those things. And so it's the exact same obstacles that we face in terms of grabbing hold of and democratically controlling our economy, which would be a prerequisite for addressing climate change, which would also give us a handle on addressing some of these other big issues.
Right, and I guess in other words, when we put that for-profit, profits over people idea first, you get that for-profit education or the for-profit prison industrial complex or and of course the people are the latter and left to deal with it, I suppose. Is there, in our final minutes here, and again, thank you so much for speaking with us. It's been an honor and a privilege. Bruce, what would you tell folks like myself who are beginning to break down the paradigms that we've been given? Of course, I'm only 25, so I don't know a world pre 9/11 or et cetera. So it's just for an example. What would you tell folks like myself who are really trying to find out what's really going on out there? What should we be doing?
Malcolm X said at one point that if you can get someone to love their enemies and hate their friends, you can get them to do anything you want. And I think there's been a lot of confusion among well-meaning people all over about exactly who our friends and who our enemies are. In particular, in the political arena, I think we have to recognize that it's not just the Republican Party that's on the side of big business, but also the Democratic Party. Big business has two parties in this country, and working people, those fighting for social justice, have none. And that has kept us hamstrung for generations. People have been fooled into thinking that the Democratic Party is somehow a solution to some of these problems when I think it's really quite a sophisticated obstacle. And I think we need to see it that way. I think one of the most important steps we could take to move forward in actually taking control of our lives, solving some of these big problems, would be to break with the Democratic and the Republican parties and begin organizing independently as working people to fight for political power in our own name.
Amen. Hallelujah. I cannot say it any better myself. Bruce Lesnick, the longtime political activist and writer blogging at opensalon.com. Bruce, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.
How cool was it? Not only, well, I want to get into this article too, by the way, for folks who haven't read it yet, but how cool was it that Bruce got back to me right away and did an awesome interview? That was absolutely amazing. So again, big thanks to Bruce Lesnick. You can find that article. We put a link to it on our Facebook page, but it's at open.salon.com as well as commondreams.org. And Scott, let's just dive into this because it's so good. And dive in come in anytime you want, man. But I just start at the beginning. It's a good place to start, right? Bruce writes in the article, Good News, Bad News for Addressing Climate Change. First, the bad news. To address anthropologic climate change, capitalism will have to be replaced as the dominant world economic system. So how do we know this? Well, we know that eliminating an ongoing exposure to a poison is a prerequisite for curing an illness due to that poisoning, right? We know that any hope of modifying a dog's aggressive behavior requires, at the minimum, that you stop rewarding the animal when it is aggressive or bites someone, right? So in short, we know that to solve a problem, you must eliminate the causes before you can hope to effectively treat the symptoms. How many times have we talked about problems and solutions? And trying to cut through all the crap to get to what are the real systemic problems so we can identify real systemic solutions, right? And
the difference is what you meant to say, I think, there was difference between problems and symptoms of the problem.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Thank you.
You said solutions, but that's all right. But yeah, I mean, the point is that every day we're bombarded with symptoms, and no one ever talks about the actual cancer itself. That's why every nightly news has this, I don't know if you're on the East Coast or not, but there's an Arctic vortex descending on the East Coast, and it's going to have single-digit temperatures, the coldest it's been in over 20 years. Yeah. And no one ever mentions that, by the way, this is man-made and, result of climate catastrophe. that is anthropogenic. Anthropogenic.
Anthropogenic, which I probably mispronounced.
That's all right. Resulting from the influence of human beings on nature. But yeah, it's all our fault, and it never discussed in the corporate media or even around the dinner table. People are just like, oh, it's awfully cold out. I mean, there's just the disconnect is just astounding, and so we have to break through that disconnect and put the pieces together for people, and then have the light bulb go on and go, huh, I never thought of it that way. Because we do have control.
Exactly, and one of the key pieces to this puzzle that Bruce, I think really correctly identifies, and we've been talking about this piece for a long time, is capitalism. He writes, within capitalism, there is room for reform short of dismantling the entire economic framework. Every wage increase, every union victory, every advance in civil rights or civil liberties falls under this category. But climate change is different. And this is something we've talked about as well. It's a whole different argument. It's not just like one little thing or this little thing. It's like we're talking about the existence of us. And addressing climate change is not a matter of dealing with one power plant or one factory or one industry. It's a globalized systemic problem. With enough pressure, you can get the powers that be to clean up a particular river or ban a particular toxic chemical or right a particular injustice if you work hard enough for it. But there's really no way to end the systemic pollution or the systemic poisoning of the environment or systemic generalized injustice without ending the incentives that encourage those behaviors. Oh, back to the root causes of the problem.
In other words, you can't change the players and expect the players to change the game. It's antithetical. It makes no sense. And so that's the whole misunderstanding that people have, is that, because they are not really paying attention. People have opinions, and very few have the whole story. They have some facts, but not everything. And so, you can blame politicians, you can blame the Koch brothers, you can blame individuals, but the reality is it's a system that rewards this kind of behavior. And that's the profit motive. That's the economic system, where you internalize profits and externalize expenses, and externalize climate catastrophe. And so it's insane. And so until we figure out a way to stop feeding this mania for more fossil fuels and constant expansion of our so-called society, as we know it anyway, we're doomed. We're doomed. And so we have to figure out a new way of living. And if we don't, well, that's the end of it.
Dun, dun, dun. So then, what are, I'm going back to Bruce's article, what are the steps needed in order to avoid really the worst case scenario effects of runaway climate change? And we talked about just recently the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that reported unless the majority of known oil, coal, and gas reserves remain in the ground, there is little hope of capping global warming at 2 degrees Celsius. We've been talking about that for over a year now when we interviewed Bill McKibben, which is available at our website at filterfreeradio.com, as well as all of our other interviews. Everything we've ever done is at the website. And meanwhile, like Scott says, it's about profits. And like Bruce said in the interview, it's about people over profits. Of course, right now what we have is profits over people. And, these energy company profits are soaring. Exxon, Shell, Chevron, BP, $169 billion with a B, $billion in combined profits 3 years ago for just that 1 year.
That's 169,000 million. So that's $1 million for 169,000 people. How big is your town?
That was an increase of 35% from the previous year, by the way. I'd like to have a pay increase of 35%.
It's hard to even use the word billion, because I think it's important to use the word thousands, millions.
Millions.
Yeah, because billion just one more, different letter. It doesn't even sink in for me. It's like, okay, 169,000 million. What's the best lottery you could ever hope to win and become rich, right? The biggest lottery winnings was what, 600 million?
Right.
It's not even half of what you talked about of what is 1 year's profits for these oil giants.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unfathomable the amount of wealth and money that's being sucked out of our economy by these systems of death.
Right. And there needs to be some restructuring going on. And these energy companies are not the only ones that really need to be massively reconstructed and restructured. According to the IPCC, the industrial agriculture is responsible for about 10 to 12% of greenhouse gas emissions. Power plants are about 33% of greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation, 28% of emissions, and commercial and residential buildings is about 11%. So clearly, to rationalize the economy in such a way as to provide for people's needs without cooking the planet requires more than a simple tweak or an amendment here or there, and it can only be done if quarterly statements and profit margins are abandoned in favor of rational planning for the needs of humans and the environment. Whatever you want to call the system that would result from such a transportation, doesn't matter. It's not capitalism. This is Bruce Lesnick writing at opensalon.com, and it's propagated to commondreams.com. We've linked to it. I want to thank Bruce for giving us a call and for the great interview there. And just to kind of sum up his article, the good news, and this is what, like I was talking about in the interview, was so motivating to me, is what it's going to take for us to solve the systemic issues of climate change really are kind of the same issues, solutions to other problems like poverty and injustice and the military-industrial complex, the endless wars and persistent racism, and especially the economic exploitation and the inequality, the pollution, the waste. It turns out, this is Bruce writing, it turns out there are massive profits to be made from each of these. Laying the foundation for solving any one of these opens the door to really addressing them all. So as big a challenge as addressing climate change may turn out to be, winning that battle would make it possible to improve the world in countless other ways. It's really the ultimate win one, get one free proposition, right? And I love that. Think about that. And this is, of course, why you never hear in anywhere else, especially, of course, the corporate bought and paid owned media, you don't hear conversations about real systemic solutions to real systemic problems, because in the end, that would mean the end to the propaganda mongers.
No, these people all have vested interest in the status quo. I mean, let's face it, you rise to the top of these systems, you sure so don't want to see them go away. That would mean the end of your lifestyle, the end of your, comfortable living and profitability. And, I have friends that make six figures working for the security surveillance state. I mean, if you look in the Washington Post for jobs, 35-40% of jobs are security and homeland, and surveillance related. They're police jobs. In an economy where what is it? I mean, a good 10%. I guess the actual numbers are closer to 20% of the entire U.S. population is unemployed or underemployed. It's more like 25% if you count those of us who are working part time.
Right.
And so it's just, and what are we doing? I mean, we're just, it's really endemic of a system that rewards this kind of behavior for profit. I mean, it's the whole beware of the military-industrial complex, for it will one day take us over. And God, how right was that guy? I mean, I can't remember what president that was. But,
Eisenhower warned us of the military-industrial complex. But
blank out of my presidents. Yeah.
But we digress, shall we? No. Let's run to a real short break here at the bottom of the hour. The first half an hour is flown by really fast. I want to thank again our special guest for the first half an hour there, longtime political activist and blogger Bruce Lesnick. If you haven't already read that article, you need to go read Good News, Bad News for Addressing Climate Change over at open.salon.com, and it's also on commondreams.org. We're going to continue the unfiltered conversation, the news of the day, lots more coming up. Socialism in Seattle is a victory for all of us, and the last gasp of American democracy, next on Filter Free Radio.